Ask that all of you bear with me. I'm still dealing with a little bit of nausea, so I won't be shaking any hands tonight. All right, last Wednesday night, we covered the beginning of Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and we noticed how that he has kind of shifted a little bit here in chapter 5 from the previous 4 chapters where he has been observing things. Now he's actually giving direction. It's more similar to some of the aspects of the Proverbs. This is advice. This is referencing, really kind of putting into real world practicality the wisdom that he's already observed. And so we noticed the importance of backing up the things that you say rather than just relying on many words. This is walk prudently when you go to the house of God, draw near to hear rather than to give the sacrifice of fools, for they do not know that they do evil. Fools don't listen. They just kind of do what they want to do or do what they think the other person's, or God in this matter, is going to want. They don't actually listen and do what they're told. And that's why verse 2, he builds on that. Do not be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart utter anything hastily before God. And of course we talked last week about the fact that this doesn't mean that we can't have long prayers. That's not what he's saying. It's the aspect of saying things without really meaning them. And the thought process that because I say a lot of words, even though I don't really think about what I'm saying or I'm not really putting any thought into it, that somehow it's going to count before God. And so when he says, do not be rash with your mouth, let not your heart utter anything hastily before God, think when you're praying to God. And sometimes we're in a state where we've got such overwhelming cares, concerns, and whatnot, that sometimes we don't know what to ask for. Paul deals with that in Romans chapter 8. The aspect that there is a means by which when we pray to God, our spirit and Christ takes the petition of our hearts, not just our words, but everything that we are feeling, everything that the overwhelming nature that with which we're praying perhaps, the emotional aspect of it, and all of that is given to God. So he is aware of what we feel. But even so, we need to be careful with what we say, to recognize that we're approaching the Creator. For God is in heaven and you on earth, therefore let your words be few. Wise, let your words be wise. Not that you can't say an hour of prayer before you go to bed, but the prospect that in that hour of prayer, you need to make sure what you mean what you say. Verse 3, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. And there's a parallel verse in verse 7, which kind of references this a little bit. So, I'll give you my take on verse 3. Apparently, verse 3 is the subject of some debate among scholars and commentaries and such as to exactly what he's saying here. I've got my own thought on this. I'll tell you what Garrett says. I don't agree with him, but it could very well be. So, the way the New King James writes this, for a dream comes through much activity, and a fool's voice is known by his many words. He's going to build on, this is kind of the establishment of a proverb where he goes to apply a principle in verse 4, which is the vows to God. So verses 3 through 7, to me, are all combined. This is all one thought process, verses 3 through 7. Verse 3, a dream comes through much activity. I forget if it's the American Standard or the NIV that translates this. A dream comes through much or many cares. The idea here carries with it an idea of energy, okay, and the fact that it's translated in some translations as many cares. Because of cares, you are then active because you're worried about stuff or that you have things you need to take care of. Thus, you have the cares. In my mind, this is not a condemnation of dreams. In fact, if anything, it's actually a promotion of a dream comes through much activity. He's already dealt with the fact that the sleep of the man who labors, who works with his hands, who is content in the things that he has, his dreams are sweet. Okay, so the way I take this is that he's saying that on this one hand, you've got people who they're working, okay, because of all the bills they have, because of all the things they have to take care of, the responsibilities they have, they are involved in much activity. Dreams come, okay, that's something that's praiseworthy, whereas a fool's voice is known by his many words. This is how you can tell the difference between the two. If you're one who works hard and you're content and you have many dreams because you've worked hard, that's good. Whereas an individual, the opposite of working hard is not working at all, but just talking a lot. All right, and that kind of seems to fit with the fool who folds his hands and watches others work that we've referenced back in chapter 4. And so this idea is this is a contrast, all right, between the man who's willing to work and willing to back up what he needs to do with action versus the fool who wishes for things but isn't really willing to work for it. He just talks a lot. Now, apply that to verse 4. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it, for he has no pleasure in fools. Pay what you have vowed. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Do not let your mouth cause your flesh to sin, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity, but fear God. So, like I said, I tend to think verse 3 through 7, this is all one thought. He establishes that proverb at the beginning to deal with the concept of vows before God. Because you can say a lot of stuff, but the willingness to actually back it up with action to perform the vow, so to speak, that's the important part of it. Whereas fools, they rush into something and they don't really think about the cost. They don't really think about the fact that the work that needs to go into it. So verse 7, and this is where verse 3 and verse 7 connect. For in the multitude of dreams and many words there is also vanity. He's not condemning the dreams. Again, this is how I'm looking at this. He's not condemning the dreams. The dreams of the man who works with his hands and he's content, they're sweet. But in the end, is the work an end unto itself? Is the labor all that life is about? No. And many words, well, that's the voice of fools, isn't it? He's already dealt with the fact that the voice of many fools, or the words of many fools, that's vanity. Well, you know what? Dreams and labor, that's also vanity too in the end, compared to what? God. Fear God. Okay, but fear God. On both ends of the spectrum, you've got the fool who says many things but doesn't do anything. But then on the other side, you've got somebody who's willing to work and labor, but they don't recognize the purpose for which they're laboring. Maybe they aren't content with the things that they have. The whole focus is fear God. Now, Garrett, the commentary, I've read some excerpts before, he looks at verse 3 from the perspective of not a literal dream, but metaphorical dreams. Like you dream big. Okay, you've got a lot of ideas in your head and things that you want to do, but you're just not willing to do what it takes to do them. And that's how he takes verse 3, in that a dream comes through much activity. In the translation that he uses whichever one is, American Standard or NIV, that a dream comes through much care or many cares. The idea is, because I have all of these interests and all these things I want to do, I have all of these goals in mind. And then he correlates that to verse 7 with having all of these high aspirations and all these big ideas without the willingness to work for them, and saying lots of maybe good sounding words sounds great, but it's vanity. Fear God. It may be that verse 3 is a metaphorical dream, but I have a hard time understanding how it fits with the vow aspect of it. To me, the contrast between saying words and doing something, that fits very well with the vow to God. And keep in mind, so when we get to verse 4, the vow to God, you remember in the Old Testament, and even in occasions in the New Testament and Acts, we have examples of the Jews who performed vows. Okay, there were vows that were the Nazirite vow. Okay, is one that we're familiar with. That we think about John the Baptist. We think about different individuals like Paul who may have taken such a vow or something similar. Throughout the Old Law, Old Testament, we see people who make vows before God. But there are also times where those promises, those vows, whether they were, I hate to use the phrase, not so much ritualistic, but associated with the temple or with the tabernacle, okay? Whether it be a sacrifice or some aspect of what they're willing to give up. some sort of a vow that's associated that way. But then there's, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. Our kids studied it not too long ago. The fellow who made a vow, the first thing to come out of my house, I'll offer to you, and it ended up being his daughter. Who was that? Jephthah. Okay, Jephthah. He really probably should have thought before he spoke regarding that vow. And these are the types of vows that Solomon's referencing. It's not the sense that we should be taking vows. Oh Lord, I promise to do this, or I vow to do that. I take an oath here that, and we see this kind of used flippantly sometimes in media. May God strike me down if I don't blah, blah, blah. Okay? These vows were sincere under the old law. They were associated with the law, meaning they weren't just things that people just decided to come up with a lot of the times. They were actually spelled out in what God wanted from them, like the Nazirite vow. So in verse 4, when Solomon refers to this, he's referring to old law type vows. When you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. The sense being is that when you say, God, this is what I'm going to do for you. This is what I'm going to sacrifice for you, to remind myself that that serving you is the most important thing, or whatever the focus of the vow is. Don't keep putting it off and putting it off because you realize once you made it, you shouldn't have said it, because you're not really willing to follow through. Okay, you think about vows that they made before God under the Old Testament. They were sincere, or at least they were supposed to be sincere, not only when they made the vow, but when they followed through with it, because they wanted to. You only make a vow because you want to, not because you feel like you have to, not because you're trying to impress people or impress God, but because you want to offer something up to God. Verse 4, for he has no pleasure in fools. Fools just talk, right? Pay what you have vowed. So here's the working aspect of it. Okay, so you said the words, but you actually meant them and you understood what they meant when you said it. So make sure the activity comes with it. The work, the labor, whatever's involved in the vow goes hand in hand with it. Verse 5, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. This is similar to some of the language of the New Testament that Jesus would use. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Do not, of course, that's in regard to swearing, and that's the idea of not swearing as in profanity, but taking an oath, okay, is what he's specifically addressing between people, okay, not so much before God. Solomon here is addressing before God, but the truth is still the same. You don't rush into something without thinking through it first. Better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Think through it. Verse 6, let not your mouth cause your flesh to sin. The context here is regarding the vow to God. And of course, we know, does that principle apply to everything? James chapter 3? Absolutely, of course it does. But in this particular point, he's using that principle to establish the application of, in your vows to God, or the lack thereof, let not your mouth cause your flesh to sin. So if you broke a vow, you refused to pay the vow that you made to God under the old law, was it sin? Yeah, it was. Thus, verse 6, nor say before the messenger of God that it was an error. Some people think, or some commentaries suggest this is an angel. I don't think that. And Garrett kind of seems to have the same idea here, verse 6. I think we're talking about somebody of the temple. Okay, most of the vows under the old law required some interaction with the priests. And so whoever this messenger of God would be would have some correlation with the vow that was made. And so I tend to think that the Solomon's referring, verse 6, to say before the messenger of God, the servant of the temple, okay, whoever it is that you're going through to realize this vow, okay, to follow through with it, I made this vow in error. I shouldn't have said it, and I didn't really mean it, and I was just saying it to impress somebody, and it was an accident. Why should God be angry at your excuse? Okay, so when he says that it was an error, well, mistakes are made. Okay, people make mistakes. But what he's describing here was that it was a deliberate mistake. This wasn't just an accident. This was a deliberate mistake. You had no intention of following through with it to begin with. That's why God is angry at your excuse, verse 6, and destroy the work of your hands, suggesting that there's consequences for those under the old law when they refuse to follow through their vow, especially those who never intended to follow through with it to begin with. There are definite, not only spiritual consequences, but possibly physical consequences too. Why should God be angry at your excuse and destroy the work of your hands? For in the multitude of dreams and many words, there's also vanity, but fear God. Because if you fear God, your words will mean something, and your actions have a purpose. Okay, that's when, and again, I associate verse 7 to verse 3. I associate the dreams to much activity. Okay. Thoughts through verses 3 through 7. Yes, sir.
Don't those really hinge off of 1 and 2? I mean, 3 starts with 4, and 1 and 2 is what you've been talking about. They're going to the house of God, but it's better to hear than like the sacrifice of fools, and that's what he comes along and explains in the 3 through 7. The fools with their much words, or they give a vow, they vow something kind of like Ananias and Sapphira, and not give the full price of it, or give a blemished animal. However, they're violating that vow. Seems to me that's kind of the fulfillment of 1 and 2. They're being rash with their mouth. They're uttering things they shouldn't before God. So your words need to be few. You need to be willing to listen. Don't be boasting about what you're vowing and not fulfilling it. Yeah. It seems to tie in.
Sure.
Verse 3 starts with 4 for those things that have just talked about.
Right, exactly. And verse 2, and these are principles, verse 1 and 2. Don't be rash with your mouth. Let not your heart utter anything hastily. Well, that's a principle, okay? That applies to anything. Now, Solomon's going to take that and apply it specifically to vows that people took under the old law. And walk prudently when you go to the house of God. Give your sacrifice with the full understanding of what you're doing, not just going through the motions. Thus, when it comes down to verses 3, 4, 5, and 6, to recognize that what you give to God needs to have meaning. That's where verse 7 fits. In the multitude of dreams and many words, there's vanity. Anybody can talk. Anybody can go through the motions. Anybody can do that. Fear God. Because you fear God, your mind is going to be set on what you're saying when you speak to Him, what you're doing when you offer sacrifice to Him. And that is really the fundamental focus. Is there's a lot of stuff people can do. People can talk, people can do. But if you fear God, both of those things will have meaning. And especially in your service to God. And that's the specific setting of verses 1 through 7, is your service to God. Yeah. Yes, sir.
And so verse 1 starts out the same way verse 7 ends. Walk prudently, here the King James says, keep your foot, and referring back to Exodus 3, it's holy ground.
Right.
Everyone there to worship God is a place of holiness, awe, reverence, respect. And he bookends the end of verse 7 with that same concept.
Fear God. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Anything else through verse 7? All right. Verse 8. So, verse 8, verses 1 through 7 seems clearly focused on our work before God and our thought processes in serving God, making sure that we're thinking about what we're doing, what we're saying. Verse 8, if you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness in a province, do not marvel at the matter. For high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. Moreover, the profit of the land is for all. Even the king is served from the field. All right, so coming back down, quote unquote, back down to earth, so to speak, he deals with our religious, spiritual service to God, making sure our mind's where it needs to be. But then as you perceive things around you, perceive events, perceive character of people, especially character of people in authority, you see the oppression of the poor and the violent perversion of justice and righteousness. Okay, he's already dealt with the fact that there are times where people in authority, judges, can be bribed. These are people who should be sitting in seats of righteousness and of goodness, but instead they're wicked and they're not willing to be fair in their judgments. But he says, do not marvel at the matter. Why? Why shouldn't we marvel? There are times, throughout the years, people have just kind of, something comes out in the news about a judge here or a politician there, and they're just like, man, it is so much worse than it used to be. Well, the truth of the matter is we tend to be more aware, perhaps, than we used to be. But the fact of the matter is, Solomon says, do not marvel at the matter. Why? There's a phrase that we use. Yeah, there's always a bigger fish in the sea, isn't there? Okay? And the way he says this, for high official watches over high official, and higher officials are over them. All the way up to the king, in this case, verse 9. Okay? Moreover, the profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. So at the end of verse 8 here, you go two ways about this. One is, just because that official is corrupt, they will have to answer eventually to somebody. Okay? Because a high official watches over high official. And then there's somebody above them who is supposed to be watching over them. Then someone else above them, all the way up to the king. So one way to take this is, don't marvel at the matter, because one way or another, eventually it's going to come out. And they will have to account for what they've done or haven't done. That's one way to look at that application. The other way to look at that application is, there's no end to high officials. Okay, one corrupt judge or politician or official comes, another will take his place. That's the way it has always been, and it's the way it always will be. It's not to say every politician, every judge, every official is corrupt. But when they come, eventually they go, and someone else takes over. Okay, so on either side of that spectrum of application, whether there's a check and a balance, so to speak, in this, don't marvel. Don't be like, oh well, it's over forever. There's no justice to be had ever again. Well, that's not true necessarily, because you may have one corrupt official, but there's other officials that are watching him, or should be. Okay, so that's the one application. The other is, don't marvel at it. This is nothing new. This has always been. Thoughts on the end of verse 8 here, as to which way you kind of take that application. To me, I think it could go either way. But the way he says it, for high official watches over high official, there's a hierarchy. There's a kind of a ladder, a step share of authority here. And because he words it the way that he does, I tend to look at this as, don't be consumed with this, don't be worried about it, because somebody's supposed to be watching them. Okay? Oppression of the poor, violent perversion of justice. The idea is somebody's watching. They should be. Okay? Any thoughts through verse 8 so far? Verse 9. Moreover, the profit of the land, verses 9 on through verse 11 really specifically, he's going to deal with the concept of the profit of the land. The profit of the land is for all, even the king is served from the field. In other words, even the king is dependent on the farmers, right? On the workers, on the laborers. Everything is dependent on something else, which definitely fits with verse 8 from the hierarchy point of view, in that every high official has another official that's has a higher authority than they do. But kind of to come full circle, even the king, who is to be the pinnacle of authority, he is dependent on the people in his kingdom. He has to eat from the fields, or in order for him to eat, he eats from the fields that his workers labor in. Verse 10, he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver, nor he who loves abundance with increase. This also is vanity. Solomon's already dealt with something similar in the previous chapters regarding the perspective, the priorities that men can sometimes have in their lives, in the idea that all they seek is more, more, more. And this is what Solomon deals with here in verse 10. He who loves silver. Now, notice, not just needs silver to be able to pay his bills, needs a paycheck to be able to pay what he needs to pay. He who loves silver. Remember the Sadducees and the Pharisees? The Sadducees had all the money, but the Pharisees are referred to the ones as what? What was it about money that they may not have had a lot of it, but what did they do? They were lovers of money. Okay, many times in the Gospels, Jesus spoke to the Pharisees who were lovers of money. So he who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. once he gets it, let me see if I can get the quote right. To want a thing, or to have a thing, is not so desirable as wanting a thing. It is not logical, but it is often true. Star Trek quote from Spock. The idea is often you want and want and want what you don't have, but once you finally do get it, it wasn't all you thought it was, and then you want something else or something more. And it's not logical. You would think that people who are obsessed with or love silver in this case, once they have their silver, they should be satisfied. No, that's not how it works. And so he goes, verse 10, nor he who loves abundance with increase. And of course, abundance in this particular context would suggest the idea of harvest, of goods, things that you can have, that people put their trust in, that can sustain you. With the more abundant, with the more things you get, he's not satisfied with increase. He then wants even more. This also is vanity, because the perspective, the priorities are wrong. Verse 11, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. So what profit have the owners except to see them with their eyes? Specifically, when goods increase, the consumer is the one who uses them. Isn't that what goods are for? To be used? Okay. Cereal, is cereal just there to be looked at? It's there to be eaten. Okay. Just ask my kids, they know. The idea of having goods is meant to be used for a purpose. And specifically, we're not necessarily talking about luxuries. We're talking about necessities, things that are basic, essential elements of life. So what profit have the owners, the people who created them, the people who obtained them, who don't need them, aren't going to use them, they just look at them. I've heard, sometimes I listen to those talk shows just about everything, but especially every now and then the classic car talk shows and stuff, they talk about their classic cars, and many times I've heard these guys who are just love classic cars. They get so upset when they hear about somebody who just leaves it in their garage, just goes in once a week or so, polishes it, waxes it, but never drives it, never uses it, never sits in it, just looks at it. They said this thing is beautiful, it should be shared with people, it should be driven and enjoyed, not just be tucked away inside a garage somewhere. And that's kind of the idea of what Solomon has here. What profit have the owners? They're not using it, they're just looking at it. It's not actually being used to increase someone, to give them what they need to survive, as is the case with those who are consuming them. Verse 12, the sleep of a laboring man is sweet, whether he eats little or much, but the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. And this goes back to all the way up to verse 10, actually verse 9, where the king, he's dependent on these people who are laboring. They're the ones who are creating the goods, and they are sharing those goods, selling those goods to other people. Probably in the case of kings, they're giving them some percentage of them to the king. But the sleep of the laboring man is sweet. He's worked hard. And of course, there's the thought process whether he eats little or much, whether he has a whole lot to eat, or he's just barely scraping by. He's content in what he's done. He has done the best that he can for today, so he's going to sleep and he'll wake up tomorrow and do it all over again. But the abundance of the rich, and he's not saying necessarily the rich who have the proper perspective. People can be rich in this life and still have the right priorities. It's harder, thus Jesus says, it's harder for a rich man to enter into heaven than a camel into the eye of the needle. Okay? But what he's saying is the abundance of the rich, they're not laboring. All they're doing is trying to accumulate more and more. They're not working, they're not putting into effect what goods they do have to use them to bring about something good. Instead, they're just really mainly just trying to get more and more, just to be able to look at it. Kind of similar to that, I forget if there's a name for that particular parable, but the rich man who had a silo full of grain, and the harvest was full, and filled the silo up, and he says, you know what, I'm going to have to build a bigger silo so I can store all this stuff I have. And then that night, God came to him and said, your soul is required of you. And the message, the lesson of it was, you've got more than enough. Why do you need to spend resources to build a bigger silo just to store it all, rather than you've got all you need, share it? Okay, give it to those who are in need. And that's kind of the situation in verse 12. The abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep, because he's constantly wanting more. He's already established that in verse 10. The abundance of the rich, you would think, more money, less problems, right? Less worry. I got everything I need. I don't have to worry about anything. But that's not how the saying goes, is it? More money, more problems is how the saying goes. And not to say that money is the culprit in that situation, but the fact that the temptations that tend to come with it, the scenarios people find themselves in with more money, that creates a situation where they keep constantly wanting more and more. Their life is not peaceful. They're constantly desiring more. Yeah?
You think about people that talk about winning the lottery, if I can just win $1 million, this will fix everything.
Yeah.
You see a lot of the lottery winners that end up broke in worse shape than they were before they won the lottery.
Yeah, yeah, and without many friends at that point too. It's amazing how many friends come out of the woodwork that you haven't seen in 50 years when you win the lottery or you get rich, or however you come across those millions. People come from all over the place because they want what you have, right? And yeah, so often because they're not prepared, and a lot of times, and I'm not saying this is true all the time, sometimes people are in the states that they're in because of things outside their control. But there are times where people are poor because they aren't very good, what's the word? Stewards, thank you. Good stewards of what they have, okay? They make poor financial decisions, poor choices, and as a result, they end up in situations where they're spending their paychecks on their lottery tickets, okay? And then when they do get rich, they end up broke again because they weren't prepared to be able to use those funds appropriately. They just wasted it all. And, you know, the abundance of the rich will not permit him to sleep. That carries with this idea that there's going to be the rich are constantly wanting more and more. And not all, I'm just saying, but generally speaking, this is the mind of people who love silver, going back to verse 10, who love silver, who love money, who love riches. That's their state. That's their life. And of course, the end result that Solomon concludes is that this is all vanity. What difference does it make? That's why verse 12, the sleep of the laborer man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. Is that man still blessed? Especially if he has the proper perspective, priorities to fear God. Is God going to hold it against him that he didn't have a whole bunch of money in his bank account when judgment came? Is God going to dangle that in front of him? You should have made a whole lot more money than this other fellow. No. He did what he could. He worked with what he had. He supported his family. May not have been a lot, but the sleep of the labor man is sweet, whether he eats little or much. Because he worked hard, he's content with what he has the proper perspectives. Anything through verse 12. Verse 13. There is a severe evil which I have seen under the sun. Riches kept for their owner to his hurt. But those riches perish through misfortune. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return, to go as he came. He shall take nothing from his labor, which he may carry away in his hand. When Solomon says, verse 13, there is a severe evil, he's not saying that this is a sinful situation that man is forced into. That's not the type of evil he's describing. And he's not saying that God has done this. That's not it either. The specific aspect is riches kept for their owner. These are the actions of people. This isn't just life, because here's the nature of life. Naked we were born, naked we will die. Okay? We didn't bring anything into this world, we will not take anything out. That's something that's repeated in the New Testament. But it's the perspectives, the priorities of man that make this a severe evil. This is why Solomon observed it's not just the state of life. The state of life is what it is. It's man that has crooked perspectives. Riches kept for their owner to his hurt. The typical logical thing to think is that the more I have, the better off I am. But Solomon says, I've seen it where the more somebody has, the worse off he is, to his hurt, he says. And not necessarily, in fact, I tend to think that Solomon isn't even describing necessarily just physically. Verse 14, he's going to describe the fact that riches can be lost. But going even further than that, there's a misappropriation of priority, of focus, of what he's seeking to obtain that goes just beyond the loss of physical things. To his hurt. Those riches perish through misfortune. Things happen. Tornado comes, knocks a silo down, all that grain gets scattered everywhere. It's gone. I mean, things happen. When he begets a son, there is nothing in his hand. Talking about the son's hand. Okay, when a son is born, he doesn't bring anything with him. As he came from his mother's womb, naked shall he return. Okay, just as he was born without anything, he'll die without anything. To go as he came, he shall take nothing from his labor which he may carry away in his hand. The concept of when he begets a son, especially from the perspective of having riches, a lot of times, and we try to do our best to prepare for our kids' future, okay? Whether it is some kind of inheritance when we pass away, some kind of college fund, some kind of whatever, just to kind of help them to prepare them, okay, for the future. Every parent, I'm sure at some point, wants that. Grandparents even try to do their best to help support their grandchildren. But the truth of the matter is, when that child is born, are they going to die with anything more than they came into this world with which they came into this world? No. That's the reality. Okay. It's not wrong to have a savings account for your kid or your grandchild to be or something where you're just something to help them. That's fine. But this is dealing with perspectives, the priorities of this individual. That's why he says, he shall take nothing from his labor which he may carry away in his hand. To me, the end of verse 15 is going back to this father. All the riches that he has, all the things that he stored up, first of all, those riches perish through misfortune. That happens. You have a son, you try to store up the stuff for them, but in the end, you will take nothing from your labor that you may carry away with your hand. And neither will your son, and neither will his son. This is also a severe evil. Just exactly as he came, verse 16, so shall he go. What profit has he who has labored for the wind? All his days he eats in darkness, and he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. So, first of all, anything through verse, let's see, we started with verse 13 on through verse 15 so far? Okay, and notice that this severe evil is all about the character of man involved in the priorities and perspectives that he has regarding the world. This is also a severe evil. Okay, again, this has nothing to do with life, it has nothing to do with God, it has to do with the perspective and the character of man. Just exactly as he came, so shall he go. Well, that's life. That's not the evil. The evil is, what profit has he who has labored for the wind when, verse 17, all his days he eats in darkness, he has much sorrow and sickness and anger. Is everybody, verse 17, who labors? When you work all day, you come home, do you have much sorrow, sickness, and anger? Is that all of us? Is that what he's describing? Anybody who's working under the sun? Who's he describing? One who has the wrong priorities. And especially, we're dealing with those who are wealthy, verse 15. Verse 16, what profit has he who has labored for the wind? What is the wind here in this case? The wind is lasting profit. Lasting profit. That's what the wind is. They're seeking lasting profit from the things of the world when they should be seeking it from God. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with verse 16 and 17 next week. Thank you, everybody.